Hello PC people, this is Dave.
And Jacob.
Here once more to talk about graphics cards, because they just won't stop releasing new ones. Look, we've got an Nvidia GTX 1660 now.
Yeah, it's a completely different situation compared with last year, when all we wanted was new GPUs.
And it also means that Jacob gets to keep doing his happy new graphics card dance too. Dance, Jacob, dance.
Is that good enough?
Yeah, that's right.
I wasn't expecting that. So yes, Nvidia has launched its new GTX 1660 graphics card, and because this is a partner launch and it can't be asked to do the whole Founders Edition rigmarole for the 16 series GPUs, we've got a shiny new overclocked version here from Gigabyte.
After the release of the TI version last month, it's no surprise that we've now got a standard card. But as the mainstream part of the graphics card market gets ever more crowded, where can this new GPU position itself?
It needs to be cheaper and slower than the GTX 1660 Ti, or risk cannibalizing its sales. But it also needs to be cheaper and faster than AMD's best Polaris to be relevant. So how does it do?
As it's the non-TI version of the GTX 1660, it's using the exact same TU116 GPU as the GTX 1660 Ti. Inevitably, it's a stripped back version, but surprisingly it's not been cut that deeply by Nvidia surgeons, engineers, whatever.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about this latest spin of the RTX less Turing GPU. Where the Ti card has 1536 CUDA cores, the straight GTX 1660 has 1408 CUDA cores. That's just 2 SMs short of the full GPU and just an 8% drop in core count.
And that makes it the smallest GPU slice Nvidia has ever taken out of a chip for a non-TI version of a GeForce graphics card.
Between the 1050 Ti and the 1050, for example, there is a 16% delta, while for the GTX 1080 Ti and the 1070 Ti cards, it's a difference of 20 and 21% respectively. The closest comparison really is the cut Nvidia made when creating the 3GB version of the GTX 1060. When cutting the GP106 GPU down to size, it lost 10% of its CUDA cores, from 1280 to 1152.
That says more about the current graphics card market than it does about Nvidia's GPU generosity, however. It couldn't slice too much performance off the chip, or you'd be looking at 1060 level gaming performance. And that just doesn't cut it these days, with the RX 590 doing its thing, and the RX 580's price dropping and dropping.
The biggest change with the GTX 1660 then is in the memory design. Here Nvidia has changed its Turing TAC and shifted from GDDR6 memory to the old school GDDR5.
That means a switch from 12 gigabits per second to 8 gigabits per second, and a 33% drop in memory bandwidth, from 280 gigabytes per second to 192 gigabytes per second.
That won't make a massive difference in terms of overall gaming performance, but does change the total bill of materials for the new card. GDDR6 may not necessarily be in HBM2 realms of super expensive memory tech, but switching to GDDR5 will likely represent a pretty significant cash saving.
In terms of the clock speed, there isn't a lot between the GTX 1660 and its Ti brethren. The reference frequencies have the boost clock of the newer GPU at 1785 MHz and the Ti running at 1770 MHz. That said, the Gigabyte GTX 1660 we're testing here is an overclocked version, and that comes with a hefty 1830 MHz clock speed.
The first thing to say is that Nvidia hasn't just delivered a graphics card with 1060 level performance for $200-ish. The GTX 1660 is tangibly faster than the GTX 1060.
We salute you, little card, but your time is most definitely over.
In reality, the main target for the 1660 is the RX 590 from AMD. That's the card responsible for Nvidia having to cut close to the Ti bone in terms of the GTX 1660 specifications, and it's actually a rather close-fought battle between the two.
On the whole, the Nvidia card in this $220 or £200 Gigabyte overclock trim does outperform the top AMD Polaris GPU. There are no Founders Editions in this Nvidia partner launch, so I'd expect a good number of the 1660 cards you find on the shelves will be overclocked to some extent.
And that means the GTX 1660 is doubling down on the Ti version's efforts to make the RX 590 entirely obsolete.
With Deus Ex and Battlefield 5, two traditionally AMD favouring titles, you'll get more out of the Polaris GPU, however. At 1080p in Deus Ex, the GTX 1660 is 11% slower than the RX 590, and the delta is 7% in Battlefield 5.
Interestingly, the difference is less noticeable in Deus Ex running at 1440p, where the Nvidia GPU is just 2 FPS lower.
But for the majority of our gaming suite, the GTX 1660 is either running at the same speed or slightly ahead of the RX 590, and doing it with a lower price tag too.
In 3D Mark TimeSpy, the 1660 delivers a 15% higher score, and is even faster than the RX 590 in both Far Cry New Dawn and Assassin's Creed Odyssey, both of which are essentially AMD games.
The The biggest gap is in Warhammer 2, where the 1660 is at least 27% faster than the top Polaris GPU, which is a surprisingly large gap, though definitely an outlier.
It's worth reiterating that these benchmarks are for the overclocked Gigabyte version of the GTX 1660. Its higher boost clock means it's running between 1965 and 1920 MHz under load, while the reference frequency is 1770 MHz, so it is a pretty healthy clock speed bump.
Reference clock versions will run slower, but arguably not by too much. Certainly overclocking this board, delivering a solid 2010 MHz under load, only yielded a solitary frame per second, maybe 2 at best.
Yep, that's the verdict. In the GTX 1660, Nvidia has created the best $200-ish graphics card. It's a mix of a $220 price tag and serious 1080p and 1440p gaming performance, means that it's now the go-to card for system builders on a budget.
On the whole, it outmuscles the RX 590, who's the GTX 1060 into touch, and is priced at a point that makes it harder to recommend the sub-$200 RX 580.
And on that point, the mainstream AMD Navi GPUs are set to launch in the middle of this year.
Probably.
Yeah, probably. And that's going to mean its manufacturing will switch focus away from Polaris, and that fat mainstream GPU inventory will shrink, and prices will inevitably start to rise because of it.
That's going to leave the GTX 1660 as the only mainstream gaming town. Well, until AMD brings the GPU Navi party out to play anyway.
It does need to be said, however, that while this overclocked GTX 1660 is $220 or £200 right now, that looks to be a bit of a launch day sale price. Newegg lists that price is only good for 7 days post-launch, though it's only likely to rise by a tenner or so.
I don't know if it's just us, but despite its evident gaming chops, there's a certain malaise around this latest card. Because things are so tight, both in terms of pricing and performance, it feels like the GTX 1660 is only doing just enough to get by. But then, so was the TI version, limited as it was by the price-performance ratio of the RTX 2060 just above it.
Then there is the fact that GTX 1660 isn't really bringing us anything that new. Yes, it's comfortably faster than the GTX 1060, and has a lower launch price to boot, but because it's trading blows with the RX 590 in games, it's giving us similar levels of performance at a similar price point.
Still, that doesn't change the point that if you were starting a new gaming PC build from scratch and operating on a tight budget, the GTX 1660 is the new price-performance king. But if you're sitting on a GTX 1060 or an RX 580 right now, this probably isn't the upgrade for you.
That's the new GTX 1660 then. A great little GPU, though maybe not the vital upgrade of choice for last-gen mainstream gamers.
Nvidia's 16 series is here in earnest then, leaving only the $180 GTX 1650 to come, though maybe there'll also be a $100 GTX 1630, who knows.
Whatever, thanks for watching, and if you liked what you've seen, give us a thumbs up, and click that little thumbs up on your screen. Ooh, 2 thumbs up.
Yeah, just give us a thumbs up.
Oh, just give us a thumbs up?
Yeah, do.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, and then subscribe as well.
Yeah,
that's the worst that can happen.
Yeah, subscribe to the channel. Yeah, you could also go out and check PCGamesN.com for more PC hardware and gaming stuff too. Thanks for watching.